everyone, and welcome back to our course. In this lecture, we are going to learn how to build out a second table for cross-referencing. So let's go ahead and create a new code cell and create a new query. We're going to open up the query with our 3 quotation marks and end it that way as well. We're going to use the command create table in SQLite if it doesn't already exist. The table name will be owner for the owners of pets. Next, we can pass in the attributes that we can give to each owner. Each owner should have an ID to identify it, which will be an integer data type. Each owner can also have a first name, which will be a variable character that can be maximum 20 characters length. As well, each owner should have a last name that should be a variable character that can be maximum 20 characters in length. Okay, as well, our owner may have some contact phone number or email address. So we could pass in those as well, their date of birth, their address. Let's put in an address. This can be a variable character of maximum 20 characters. We could also have a city as part of their address. Again, a variable character. You can also have a country and a zip code. This can be a variable character. And like we said, zip code, which can also be a variable character. All right, so here we have passed in a bunch of different properties about an owner. The address or the city, sometimes the city can be implied from the address, but not always. Sometimes you can have the same address in different cities. Same with the country and the city. Sometimes you can derive a country from a city, but not always. So you could place content about the city, the country into its own table, but not always is it automatically going to be that a certain city is from one country. Some countries have the same city name. So that's why we'll leave it here in the owner table. All right, so here we go. We have a whole bunch of properties that we can possibly add to an owner. Let's end the query with a semicolon. Next, let's execute this query. So we have to use cursor.execute, and we're executing our query variable. Next, let's go ahead and put in an owner into the table. So here I'm going to create another query. I'm going to use insert, and I'm going to insert into the owner table. Here I'm going to pass in the attributes that I want to give to this owner. We didn't specify that we had to fill in any of the attributes, which means they're all optional in this case. We could give our owner an ID. And notice here that our owner has ID 1. You may remember that our pet Muffin had ID 1 as well. But because they're inside of different tables, then they can have the same ID. You can also randomly generate a number if you wanted to use a more complicated or longer integer. We can also give our owner a first name. And note here, don't pass in the value immediately, just pass in the property names first. Let's give our owner a first name. We could give our owner more properties as well if we wanted to. Then we have to fill in the values for each of the properties. So this is where we put in the 1, and then we can put in the first name, Alex. Then let's end the query with a semicolon, just per convention. And you can do that with all of your queries, but it's not required. Okay, so here we have our values that we're going to give to our owner. We're going to call cursor.execute query again. And code is read from top down, so even though we have the same line, the line is actually different because the query variable is different on each line. All right, so here we can run our code cell. Next up, let's go ahead and check that we actually were able to add an owner into our owner table. So I'm going to create another query, and I'm going to open up the query with my single quotes here. Then I'm going to use select star again from the owner table this time. And that is going to select for me all of the entries in the owner table. Then I can call cursor.execute to execute the query. The query is going to give me a result, which I can grab with cursor.fetchAll and store that as a result, and then we can inspect our result. Then if we run that code cell, look here, we have 1 Alex, none, 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 none. That's because we only gave this sample or record the first 2 attributes. Now we can cross-reference this owner inside of our pet table. For that, let's go all the way back up to where we had our pet table. Here we go. So for this pet table, we could add a new attribute, or we could change the initial table itself. Let's change our initial table here. I'm going to add a new property, and I'm going to call this my owner ID. This is going to be of type integer. This owner ID is referencing what is the owner of the pet. Then for each pet that we create, let's also pass in an owner ID. And we can pass in a value like 1 because that's currently our only owner is 1. Right, so here I'm going to select the pet. Again, for our second pet, we can insert the ID and the owner ID with values 2 and 1 in order. And finally, we had a third pet. We can give it an owner ID, and it will have the ID 1. So in this case, all pets have the same owner. Then we can rerun our code cells by going to runtime, run all. That will rerun all of our cells here. You just have to make sure that you have your table recreated, because you'll get this error here, table pet has no column named owner ID. You may be wondering, but I actually did pass in an owner ID right here. The answer is that in Colab, when we connect to a database, pets database, we actually cannot change the table directly because the table's already created. So when you try to recreate it, it will already have existed. Just because we ran all the code cells again doesn't mean the pet table got removed from SQL. So if you actually want to recreate the table completely from scratch, go to Runtime and select Factory Reset Runtime. This is going to reset our runtime here in Colab. Then we can go to Runtime Run All to rerun our cells. We had to factory reset the runtime to disconnect from our database and then be able to completely create it from scratch. Otherwise, we were still connected to the previous database, which already had a table, so we actually couldn't recreate the table. To recreate a table, you have to first factory reset the runtime. Right, so now if we take a look at our query results, we can see here we have Muffin, and Muffin now has an owner ID. Same thing with our number 2 and our number 3. All of our pets now have an owner ID of 1. And we can go into our owner, and we see here we still have our owner as well. So the point of creating a second table is that now we can cross-reference owner information. So if we had a pet like Muffin who got lost, and then Muffin was taken to the shelter, and then we looked up Muffin in the database, we would see that Muffin had ID 1, and Muffin had here the name Muffin. Then Muffin didn't have any information about Muffin's gender or date of birth, but Muffin did have an owner ID. So we know that Muffin's owner ID is 1, which means we can go to our owners table in our database, and we can see that the owner with the ID 1 is Alex, and then we know how to contact Alex, or in this case we see we have no contact information for Alex, so Muffin has to stay at the shelter. Right, so that is cross-referencing. We can get one table And because we're working with a relational database, we can cross-reference another table. And this is done very commonly across a lot of companies for lots of projects. This has been a simple example of cross-referencing, but there are many different SQL queries that get very complex and large, and cross-referencing plays a huge role in database design and working with data, especially as a developer or a software engineer. All right, so now that we've created a second table, join me coming up in our next lecture. We are going to learn how we can perform some more queries with SQL. These will be simple queries for selecting different records from our tables that meet certain attributes. So I will see you in the next lecture.